The sun was shining brightly over London, and the area around Buckingham Palace was filled with the sound of footsteps, chatter, and the clicking of cameras. People from all over the world had come to see the famous palace gates, the grand statues, and most of all the Queen's Guard. Tourists lined up behind the black iron fences. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, and couples posed for photos with the guards in the background. The guards stood tall in their iconic red coats and tall black bearskin hats, perfectly still as if carved from stone. The Queen's Guard had always fascinated visitors. They were more than just soldiers in colorful uniforms. They were symbols of tradition and discipline. Many people knew that these guards were not allowed to smile, laugh, or move unless required by duty. To outsiders, their stillness could seem almost unbelievable. How could a human being stand so stiff for hours under the sun or even in the rain without moving an inch? For most tourists, this inspired respect. But for some, it sparked mischief. Among the visitors that morning was a group of young travelers. They were in their 20s, excited to explore London, and had already taken countless selfies around the city. For them, this palace visit was another chance to make funny videos for social media. As they spotted the guard, one of them whispered, "Look at him. He doesn't even blink. Imagine if we try to make him laugh." Another laughed loudly and added, "Yes, let's see if we can break him. This will go viral." The group moved closer to the guard, their phones ready. At first, they made silly faces and exaggerated hand gestures, hoping to provoke some reaction. When the guard didn't move, they giggled louder. "He looks like a mannequin," one of them joked. "Maybe he's not even real." The people standing nearby looked uncomfortable. Parents held their children closer, whispering reminders to show respect. Some tourists frowned at the group's behavior, but no one stepped in yet. The mocking grew bolder. One of the travelers leaned forward, pretending to trip into the guard's path. Another waved his hands just inches from the guard's face. They laughed at their own actions, convinced they were entertaining everyone. But most of the crowd didn't find it amusing. Instead, there was a growing sense of unease. People murmured quietly, exchanging glances that seemed to say, "They are going too far. This is a big mistake." The Queen's Guard, however, remained still. His eyes looked straight ahead, his posture perfect. He had been trained for this, trained to ignore distractions, jokes, and attempts to break his composure. His role wasn't just for show. It carried the weight of centuries of tradition. What the group didn't understand was that the guard wasn't a performer for tourists. He was an active duty soldier serving with honor. Children in the crowd noticed the difference. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Why are they making fun of him? Isn't he a soldier?" The mother shook her head and whispered, "Yes, he is. That's why we must respect him. They don't know better." The travelers, still laughing, didn't notice the tension building around them. They were too focused on capturing the moment for their cameras. "This will get us thousands of views," one of them bragged. Another added, "Just wait until people see how fearless we are." But in truth, it wasn't courage. It was ignorance. As the mocking continued, a shift happened. The guard's eyes moved slightly. It was a small detail, but to those who had been watching closely, it was enough to feel the change in atmosphere. A hush spread through parts of the crowd. Parents hushed their children. Couples stopped posing for photos, and even the sound of camera shutters slowed. Everyone sensed that something important was about to happen. The young group, however, remained blind to the warning signs. They mistook silence for amusement. Believing they had control of the scene, they exaggerated their antics even more. One of them shouted, "Come on, say something. You're just a statue in a funny hat." His voice echoed against the palace walls, making the disrespect even sharper. A few gasps rose from the audience. One older man muttered, "They have no idea what they're doing." The Queen's Guard continued standing tall, unshaken. But deep down, the crowd knew his patience had limits. He wasn't there to entertain. He was there to protect and serve. Every stomp of his polished boots, every inch of his uniform carried authority. And the more the travelers mocked, the more they risked learning that lesson the hard way. By now, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had completely changed. What had started as a cheerful, tourist-filled morning was now tense and uneasy. The group's laughter sounded hollow against the growing disapproval of the crowd. Tourists whispered warnings to each other, shaking their heads. A few even raised their phones, ready to record. Not the antics of the group, but the reaction they knew was coming. The young travelers thought they were in control of the moment. They believed they were leading the show, that the guard's silence was proof of their victory. But in truth, they were seconds away from discovering the reality. The Queen's Guard was not to be mocked, and soon the entire crowd, and the group themselves, would understand why this was a big mistake. The crowd around Buckingham Palace had grown larger as the morning moved on. Tourists kept arriving, some with maps in hand, others with excited children pulling them closer to the gates. Street vendors sold little Union Jack flags, and cameras flashed every few seconds. For most people, the sight of the Queen's Guard was a memory worth keeping forever. Yet in the middle of all the respect and admiration, the same group of young travelers continued their mocking game. They had convinced themselves they were the stars of the moment. With their phones raised high, they laughed louder than before, each one trying to outdo the other with sillier gestures. One of them leaned so close to the guard that the brim of his hat almost touched the soldier's tall bearskin. "Look at this!" the traveler shouted to his friends, waving his arms dramatically. The others burst into laughter, clapping their hands as if they were watching a comedy show. But the crowd didn't laugh. Instead, their faces showed discomfort and even frustration. Parents pulled their children aside, not wanting them to copy such behavior. An older couple whispered to each other in disappointment. "This is not right," the woman said softly. "They don't understand the meaning behind this uniform." Her husband nodded in agreement, adding, "They are pushing their luck. Just wait. This will not end well." The young travelers, blinded by their own amusement, didn't notice the warning tone in the voices around them. To them, the silence of the guard meant success. They thought they had proven their point, that he was just a statue in a costume, powerless against their laughter. What they failed to see was the strength behind his stillness. Every second he stood unmoved was not weakness, but discipline, built through years of training. One of the travelers decided to take things further. He pretended to stumble, throwing himself forward as if he had accidentally lost his balance. His shoe scraped the ground near the guard's boots. The crowd gasped in shock, but the young man quickly stood up and laughed. "Oops! Didn't mean to trip." His friends cheered and clapped at the act, delighted with the fake performance. But not everyone saw it as a harmless joke. To many onlookers, the act was dangerous, too close to crossing a sacred line. Children in the crowd stared wide-eyed. A little girl tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, why are they being mean to him? Isn't he a hero?" The father bent down and replied gently, "Yes, sweetheart. He is a hero. He is protecting the palace. Some people forget to respect that." The girl nodded, her eyes fixed on the guard, who remained as strong as ever, his posture like a steel pillar in the middle of chaos. As minutes passed, tension spread like a shadow across the square. The group of travelers grew bolder, unaware of how close they were to serious consequences. One of them cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted loudly at the guard, "Say something! Just one word." His voice echoed through the air, bouncing off the palace walls. Gasps came from the crowd, and some people even raised their phones, ready to record what they felt was about to happen. For the guard, this was no longer just another day of service. He was trained to remain calm, but he was also trained to act when duty required. His rifle was not a prop, his boots were not for show. His role wasn't to entertain the crowd, but to stand as a line of defense, a symbol of discipline, and a reminder of respect. One sharp-eyed tourist noticed the guard's expression change ever so slightly. His eyes, which had been fixed straight ahead, shifted just a fraction. It was almost unnoticeable. But those who had been watching closely felt it. A wave of silence moved through the audience. Families grew quiet, couples lowered their cameras, and even the chatter from the far end of the square softened. It was as if everyone had agreed without speaking. Something important was about to happen. But the group of travelers didn't understand the change. They mistook the silence of the crowd for boredom. They thought the people wanted more laughter, more mockery, more antics. So one of them stretched his arms wide and said, "Fine, let's give them a real show." He stomped his feet next to the guard, mocking the soldier's posture. His friends laughed harder, their voices breaking the fragile quiet that had fallen over the square. Yet the rest of the crowd didn't join in. Instead, they exchanged worried looks. An elderly man shook his head slowly and muttered, "They have no idea what's coming. You don't play with tradition like this." A woman standing near the fence looked at her phone screen, already recording. She whispered to her friend, "Get ready. They're about to learn their lesson." The Queen's Guard stood like a mountain, silent, tall, and unmovable. But deep inside the crowd, people sensed his patience thinning. The weight of history was behind him, and centuries of discipline ran through his stance. The young travelers had pushed far beyond what was acceptable, and though they didn't know it yet, the moment of truth was only seconds away. The laughter of the group rang louder, but it no longer filled the air with joy. Instead, it clashed against the silence of the crowd. What was once a game was now a test of respect. And while the young travelers believed they were in control, the truth was clear to everyone else. The guard had the power, every heartbeat, every step of the crowd shifting uncomfortably, every sharp glance from bystanders added to the tension. The group was about to discover what discipline truly meant, and that mocking the Queen's Guard was never just a joke. The tension in front of Buckingham Palace had reached its highest point. What had started as a playful morning had now turned into a scene filled with uneasy silence. The young travelers were still laughing, still convinced they were the heroes of their own little show, but the crowd could feel something that the group could not. Everyone watching knew that the guard's patience was close to its limit. Then suddenly, it happened. The guard stomped his boot against the pavement with such force that the sound echoed across the entire square. The loud thud broke through the laughter like a lightning bolt cutting across a clear sky. People jumped at the sound, children clutched their parents, and the group of travelers froze, their grins fading instantly. The air that had once been filled with laughter and chatter was now silent, so silent that even the sound of a bird flapping its wings overhead seemed louder than usual. The guard raised his rifle in one smooth, precise motion. His voice rang out deep and powerful, carrying a weight that none could ignore. "Make way for the King's Guard." The words thundered through the air. They weren't just words. They were a command, sharp and full of authority. For the first time that morning, the young travelers realized the seriousness of the moment. Their faces drained of color and the phones in their hands suddenly felt heavier. The game was over. The crowd reacted instantly. Mothers pulled their children behind them. Tourists stepped back to clear space, and some clapped softly out of respect. Others whispered in amazement, "Did you hear that?" That's the real power of the guard. For those who had traveled thousands of miles to witness this, it was unforgettable. Not a comedy act, but a display of true discipline. The group of travelers didn't laugh anymore. Their bodies stiffened and their hands trembled slightly as they lowered their phones. The confidence they had shown moments before was gone, replaced by fear and embarrassment. They now realized the truth. This was not a performer in a costume. This was a soldier, a guardian of history, and someone who would not tolerate disrespect. The guard stepped forward with steady, deliberate movements. His boots struck the ground firmly, each step echoing like a drumbeat. The young men and women who had mocked him tried to step aside quickly. Their earlier boldness completely vanished. One whispered nervously, "He's serious. He's actually serious." Another swallowed hard, regretting every laugh and every silly gesture they had made. Around them, the crowd's respect only grew. Tourists raised their phones again, this time not to record a joke but to capture a lesson in discipline. Many would later share these videos online, describing it as the moment when the Queen's Guard reminded everyone of his true purpose. Parents whispered to their children about respect and tradition. An elderly man in the back of the crowd smiled softly and said, "That's the sound of honor. You don't mock honor." The silence was so strong that even the group of travelers could hear the pounding of their own hearts. For the first time since arriving at the palace, they weren't thinking about likes or views. They were thinking about the seriousness of their mistake. The guard's voice had carried centuries of tradition. It was the same voice that had echoed in ceremonies, in moments of crisis, and in times when discipline was the only thing standing between chaos and order. The young travelers had tried to reduce it all to a joke, but now they understood. They had been standing in front of a living symbol, not a performer. The leader of the group, the one who had shouted the loudest earlier, looked down at his shoes, unable to meet the guard's eyes. His confidence had evaporated. His friends avoided looking at each other, each one realizing the same thing. They had gone too far, but the guard didn't scold them further. He didn't need to. His stomp, his raised rifle, and his thunderous command had already delivered the message more clearly than words ever could. After a moment of silence, he returned to his original position, standing tall and still as if nothing had happened. His discipline was unbroken. The crowd let out a quiet sigh of relief, but the atmosphere remained changed. The group of travelers tried to step back into the crowd, hoping to disappear, but whispers followed them. "That's them," people murmured. "The ones who mocked him. Did you see their faces when he shouted?" The shame was heavier than any punishment. For many in the crowd, this became the highlight of their visit. They had come to see the palace and the guards, but they had also witnessed something more powerful: the difference between ignorance and respect. Some even smiled knowingly, realizing that the young travelers had learned a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. As for the guard, his face remained blank, his body still like stone. To him, this was just another duty, another moment in a long line of service. He didn't act for applause or for the cameras. He acted because it was his responsibility. The crowd stood quietly for a while, processing what had just happened. The silence was no longer tense but filled with respect. Slowly, the usual chatter and excitement returned, but this time it was different. People spoke softly, their voices carrying admiration rather than amusement. Children asked questions about the guards' training, and parents explained about loyalty and discipline. The young travelers slipped to the side, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Their phones were tucked into their pockets, forgotten for the first time that day. No one in the group spoke. They didn't need to. Each one of them carried the same thought. They had been foolish. What was meant to be a silly video for social media had turned into a serious lesson, not only for them but for everyone who had witnessed it. They had mocked the guard, but instead of breaking him, they had been the ones broken by the weight of tradition, the strength of discipline, and the silent respect of the crowd. From that moment, the group's trip through London would never be the same. Wherever they went, the memory of the guard's voice would follow them. "Make way for the King's Guard." It was a memory they would never forget, a reminder of the day they made a big mistake. The sound of the guard's command still lingered in the air even after he had returned to his still position. For the group of travelers, it was as if the world had shifted beneath their feet. Just moments before, they had been the loudest voices in the square. Now they were silent, shrinking back into the crowd, their earlier confidence replaced by shame. But the incident wasn't over. The thunderous stomp and shout had drawn the attention of the palace security team. A pair of officers dressed in dark uniforms began walking quickly toward the area where the commotion had taken place. Their faces were serious, their eyes fixed on the young group. The crowd parted respectfully to let them through, whispering as they passed. The officers stopped right in front of the travelers. One officer, tall and stern, crossed his arms and said firmly, "You there. Step aside." The travelers hesitated, but the tone in his voice left no room for argument. Slowly, they moved to the edge of the crowd where the officers could speak with them more privately, but the eyes of dozens of tourists still followed them. "You think this is a game?" the officer asked, his voice calm but sharp. "Do you have any idea how serious this is?" The travelers didn't answer. Their earlier laughter had disappeared completely. Now their heads were bowed, their cheeks red with embarrassment. Another officer spoke. "The Queen's Guard is not here for your entertainment. They are soldiers, trained and serving their country. When you mock them, you don't just disrespect the man standing there, you disrespect centuries of tradition." His words were steady, almost like a teacher scolding students, but there was no mistaking the weight behind them. The travelers tried to explain. One of them muttered, "We didn't mean harm. We thought it was just funny." But the officer cut him off. "Funny, you almost touched him. You shouted in his face. That is not funny. That is unacceptable." The crowd around them didn't need to hear every word to know what was happening. They could see it in the travelers' faces. The lesson was being delivered, and it was being delivered hard. Some people nodded approvingly. A mother whispered to her son, "See? Actions have consequences." The boy nodded, his eyes wide as he watched the scene unfold. The embarrassment of the group grew even heavier as tourists lifted their phones to capture the moment. Dozens of videos were being recorded, not of the guards, but of them, red-faced, uncomfortable, and clearly regretful. The thought of these videos spreading online, turning them into an example of disrespect, made their stomachs tighten with dread. The officers continued their lecture. "You are lucky," one of them said. "If you had gone further, if you had tried to push past him or lay a hand on him, you could have been arrested. You could have faced a heavy fine. Do you understand that?" The travelers nodded quickly, their voices barely above a whisper. Yes, we understand. Meanwhile, the crowd's attention returned to the guard, who still stood in perfect form as if nothing had happened. His stillness seemed even more impressive now, after the outburst that had silenced the entire square. People clapped softly, not in applause but in respect. One elderly tourist wiped a tear from her eye and whispered, "Such discipline, such strength." The travelers standing with the officers wished they could vanish into the ground. They had come to London for fun and adventure, but now they were being treated like schoolchildren who had crossed a line they never should have touched. The officers finally told them, "You may stay and watch, but you will show respect. Do not repeat what you did." The group nodded again, their earlier bravado completely gone. They stepped back into the crowd, trying to blend in, but the whispers followed them everywhere. "That's them," people said, "the ones who mocked the guard." And within minutes, the videos began to spread online. Tourists posted them with captions like, "Disrespectful travelers learn their lesson," and "Don't mess with the Queen's Guard." By the end of the day, thousands of people would see the clips, and the group would find themselves the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. As the ceremony continued near the palace gates, the atmosphere shifted back to normal, but it wasn't quite the same as before. The incident had left a mark. The crowd seemed more reverent, more thoughtful. Children asked questions about the guard's training, and parents explained with care. "They stand here for hours, no matter the weather," one father said. "It's not easy. It takes strength and pride in their duty." The young travelers listened silently, though no one was speaking to them directly. The words reached their ears all the same. For the first time, they truly began to understand. They had treated the guard like a character in a play, but in reality, he was a soldier representing an entire nation. Their mocking had not been harmless. It had been a mistake that nearly cost them far more than embarrassment. By now, they had stopped recording videos. Their phones stayed in their pockets. Their laughter was gone. They simply stood quietly, trying not to draw more attention to themselves. They had wanted to be the stars of their own social media story, but instead, they had become a warning for everyone else. This is what happens when you don't respect the guard. As the officers returned to their posts, one of them gave the group a final look, sharp and meaningful. No words were spoken, but the message was clear: never again. The sun continued to shine on Buckingham Palace, and tourists continued to smile. But the story of the mocking group had already traveled beyond the gates, and as the group walked away later that day, heads down and voices low, they knew their trip had been changed forever. What they thought would be a funny memory for their online followers had instead become a lesson they would never forget. A lesson taught not just by the Queen's Guard, but by the entire crowd who had witnessed their big mistake. The day after the incident, the videos began to spread like wildfire across the internet. Tourists who had recorded the moment uploaded clips to social media, with captions that highlighted the guard's discipline and the travelers' poor behavior. Within hours, the comments poured in from all corners of the world. Some people expressed shock at the disrespect, while others praised the Queen's Guard for handling the situation with strength and dignity. The young travelers who had mocked the guard quickly realized they were no longer anonymous tourists in London. Their faces were everywhere, on phone screens, in news articles, and across countless comments. The same phones they had used to film their jokes now became sources of regret. Every time they opened their apps, they were reminded of the mistake that had turned them into an example for millions. At first, they tried to laugh it off among themselves. "It's not that serious," one of them said, forcing a smile. "People will forget in a week." But the others weren't so sure. The sheer number of comments, the serious tone of people's reactions, and the way strangers pointed at them when they walked in the city made it clear this wasn't going to disappear quickly. The travelers sat together in their hotel that evening, scrolling through the videos. Some clips had already reached thousands of views. Others had gone even further. One of the travelers covered his face with his hands and sighed deeply. "We really messed up," he admitted. The room fell silent. No one argued. For the first time, they all agreed. Back at Buckingham Palace, the guard they had mocked continued his duty without change. To him, what happened was just one more moment in a long line of experiences. He wasn't there for social media fame or to teach lessons. He was there because of his role, his service, and his discipline. Yet, without knowing it, He had left a deep impression on countless people. Tourists who had been in the crowd told the story to their families. Parents explained to children about respect, about discipline, and about the importance of traditions. Teachers in different countries even showed the video to students, using it as an example of why mocking others, especially those in service, was wrong. The simple stomp and command from one guard had traveled further than anyone expected. The young travelers knew they had to respond. They couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. The pressure grew heavier with each passing day. Finally, they decided to record an apology. Sitting in a quiet room with serious faces and lowered voices, they spoke directly to the camera. "We want to say sorry," the leader of the group began. "We came to London excited to see everything, but we made a big mistake. We didn't understand the importance of the Queen's Guard. We thought it was funny, but we know now it was disrespectful. To the Guard, to the people who were there, and to everyone who saw the videos. We are sorry." Their apology spread as quickly as the original videos. Some people forgave them, saying it took courage to admit their mistake. Others still criticized them, insisting they should have known better from the beginning. But one thing was clear: the lesson had been learned. In the days that followed, the group's behavior changed noticeably. When they visited other landmarks, they stood quietly, observing with respect. They listened more carefully to tour guides, read signs about history, and even reminded each other not to act foolishly in public. The shame of that one morning at Buckingham Palace had reshaped how they approached the rest of their trip. For the crowd that had been present that day, the story became something they shared again and again. People described the exact moment the guard stomped his foot, the way his voice shook the air, and the look on the travelers' faces when they realized the seriousness of the situation. Some laughed about the sudden shift, but beneath the humor was always respect. Respect for the guard, respect for the tradition, and respect for the lesson that everyone had witnessed. The videos remained online for weeks, continuing to spread to people who hadn't even known the story at first. Each time someone watched, they saw not just the group's mistake, but also the guard's strength. They saw how quickly the atmosphere changed when discipline stood up against mockery. It was a reminder that respect was not old-fashioned, it was timeless. Eventually, the group returned to their home country. The trip they had once planned as a series of fun adventures had turned into a journey they would never forget. Friends and family asked them about the incident, and though it embarrassed them, they explained honestly what had happened. "We thought it was just a joke," one of them would say. "But it wasn't, it was disrespect, and we learned that the hard way." Years later, when the travelers looked back on their trip, they remembered more than just the sights of London. They remembered the silence after the stomp, the booming voice of the guard, and the feeling of the crowd turning against them. It had been one of the most uncomfortable moments of their lives, but also one of the most important. It taught them a lesson that no classroom, no lecture, and no book could have taught so strongly. The Queen's Guard remained unchanged. Day after day, new guards took their posts, standing tall and silent before the gates of the palace. Tourists still came, snapping pictures and watching in awe, and though many tried to see if the guards would flinch or smile, far fewer dared to mock them again. The story of the travelers who made a big mistake had spread far enough to remind people. Mocking the guard was not only unwise, it was disrespectful for the crowd that had been there, for the millions who watched online, and for the travelers themselves. The lesson was simple but powerful. Respect matters. Some traditions are not meant to be laughed at. Some uniforms carry weight that demands honor, and some mistakes, though embarrassing, can lead to growth. That morning at Buckingham Palace began as a joke, but it ended as a story of discipline, respect, and understanding, one that would be told and retold for years to come. And for the young travelers, it was a reminder they carried for the rest of their lives. When they mocked the Queen's Guard, they thought it was a game. But in reality, it was a big mistake.